The city-state of Florence during the Renaissance. Why was it so important? So, what is a Renaissance? Renaissance literally translates to rebirth. This is a revival of art and literature specifically, and any culture or styles of art created in the 14th, 16th centuries are considered a part of the Renaissance era. And here's an example of one sculpture created in the Renaissance era to give you guys an idea. Florence is called the birthplace of the Renaissance, which is probably why it's definitely seen as one of the most important places during this time period. Because of its natural resources and its dominating wealthy class, it was able to contribute many pieces to the Renaissance time, and many of the artists were able to create beautiful, famous pieces. Rebirth suits this time period well in Florence because they look to ancient Rome and Grecian cultures and art styles to create some of their pieces that they created during the Renaissance in Florence. So here we see an example of Roman architecture and a Grecian sculpture. And now these are some art pieces that are from Florence during the time of the Renaissance. We have David's Michelangelo, which we can see a connection to the previous sculpture we saw. And then the Florence Cathedral could connect to the architecture we had seen from the Romans. So this is the way they kind of had a rebirth of the ancient Roman and Grecian cultures. And again, like I said, natural resources is one of the main reasons Florence is very important to the Renaissance time period. They had many painting pigments. They were able to probably create colors that other cultures and societies couldn't at the time. They also had an abundance of marble. And wealth was also a key factor in their success or their fame during the Renaissance. Here's a list of the wealthy families here. And the Medici family is probably the most well-known wealthy family. And the Medici family is responsible, again, for much of the wealth in Florence during this time. They made their fortunes from bankrolling popes and kings. And they were known as scholars, lovers of the arts. So perhaps that's why they took a liking to paying artists to create many of the pieces during this time. Lorenzo de' Medici is just one of the well-known members because he had a strong connection with the people of Florence. He wanted them to be happy and entertained, which is just another way that this specific family contributed to the art created during the Renaissance era in Florence. And now I'm just going to run through some of the artwork created during the Renaissance time because I want you guys to see the themes of how it was revival of ancient cultures, what became new, how they used their resources, the different ways the pigments were used for the paintings. So first we're going to look at the Florence Cathedral as I showed before. Here we can see a connection with the previous architecture that we had seen from the Romans. And during the time, this was a very unique piece and it was very impactful in the Renaissance because the brick pattern and the ribs of the structure were thought to be of genius. So this is just one example of why Florence could be so important is because they were very innovative during the time when it came to architecture and seeking inspiration from the past for their architecture. Michelangelo's David, perhaps many people already know this, so we can see how the natural resources were used. We can see how marble was being used in this time, how they were creating sculptures and other creative forms from their natural resources. And again, we can see the connection to the ancient Grecian sculpture that I showed earlier. So it's sticking with this idea of rebirth and why Florence was so impactful during the Renaissance. And now I'm going to examine Botticelli's Birth of Venus. This is one of my personal favorites. I do think the goddess Venus is very nice, and she comes from the ancient Romans. She's the goddess of love, beauty, and desire. So yet again, another example of the rebirth of the Roman culture. So we can see how goddesses and different figures are being used. Here you can see many different colors, many different shades in this painting, and that is how they utilize their pigments. And another image, another painting by the same artist. And this one is interesting because it's called Allegory of Spring. So it depicts spring, it depicts gods and goddesses in this kind of human way, which may connect to how ancient Greek and Romans saw their goddesses and gods because they would come down and get connected with the human life, and it was very intertwined. There was not necessarily a huge separation between the gods and the humans besides the fact that the gods had powers. And And as much as they were respected, they definitely connected to human form. So that could be even what we're seeing here through this painting. So these are all of the ways in which the artwork can reflect why Florence was so important during this time.